Great. It looks like we are now live. If people are just starting to tune in, it's really great to have you here. Really great to have everyone on the call. And I'm just noticing we are missing at least one video here. But as people are starting to listen in, just so you folks know, we are about to have a conversation about food security before, during, and after COVID-19. We have some really great people on the call with us who are knowledgeable, have been doing work in this field for a long time, and I'm really looking forward to all of the questions. Looks like we already have a few people tuning in, and just so you know, we're going to take a few minutes as we get a few more people on the line and a few more of our panelists up on the screen. And thanks so much for joining us. So looks like we've got about 10 people on so far. And we also have a long list of your questions that you've submitted in advance. And I'm just gonna check in because Joan, I know you're on the line and you're one of our panelists, you're amazing. If you can connect your video and your audio, then you'll show up on everybody's screen along with us so they can see you as well. And maybe in the meantime, what I'll do is I like to start off all of these conversations acknowledging the territory that I'm on. So I'm here on the homelands of the Lekwungen speaking peoples of the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations. If you're tuning in right now and you want to put into the comments on Facebook where you are currently tuning in from and the territory that you're on, we'd love to hear where people are tuning in from and just have that piece where we're grounded in the homelands and the territory. And I want to also acknowledge we have a big gap in our panel today. We actually don't have someone speaking to the Indigenous food sovereignty kind of lens and aspect of this conversation. We did reach out to a few people, but it's a big gap in the conversation. And so just want to acknowledge that and also know that we're going to be having more of these conversations and we'll definitely be bringing in more voices and we'll be having that conversation about Indigenous food sovereignty. So hope those questions come up regardless and we can talk a little bit about it, but just acknowledging the gap. And so I see we've got Joan on, which is great to see your face, Joan. Hello, hello. And what I think I'll start by doing is maybe just letting each of you introduce yourself. We'll just go by the order that I see you on my screen here. So we'll start with Paul Taylor. We'll go to Aaren, we'll go to JJ, we'll go to Joan, and then hopefully our other Joan will be able to join by video and along with the audio as well.
For sure, yeah, I'm Paul Taylor, the Executive Director of FoodShare Toronto. My pronouns are he, him, his. FoodShare is a food justice organization in Toronto that's been doing pretty awesome work for the last 30 years. I think I might be biased though, but hope to share a little bit more.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for being here, Paul. Really appreciate having you on the call. Next up is Aaren Topley, and Aaren Topley is from Can You Dig It? Aaren, if you want to jump in.
Great. Hi, my name's Aaren Topley. I'm a settler here on the homelands of Lekwungen people, now known as the Songhees and Esquimalt Nation. I go by he, him pronouns. Really excited to be here. I'm the provincial manager of Can You Dig It, which is a program of the Public Health Association of BC. The program really focuses on community gardens and community growing spaces within the province.
Wonderful. So great to have you on the call, Aaren. Thanks for being here. Next up, we have JJ Ford, who's one of the farmers at Mason Street City Farm. JJ, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Laurel. Yeah, thanks for having me today. My name is JJ Ford. I am also here, like Laurel and Aaren, on the homelands of Lekwungen speaking people and hail from where Paul is sitting on the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe homelands. And I've been living here for about 6 years and I work at Mason Street City Farm, which is a small urban farm in downtown Victoria where we grow food for the community. And the spot where we're at right now, we've been growing food here, not me personally, but different folks over the years in some capacity for about 30 years now.
Thanks so much, JJ. And I will pass it over to Joan Stonehocker, and she's Executive Director of LifeCycles Project Society. Joan, over to you.
Hi, so I'm Joan Stonehocker. As you just said, you stole my first line. So LifeCycles connects people to the food they eat and the land that it grows on. We've been operating in southern Vancouver Island, which is the homeland of the Lekwungen speaking people, as most of the people on this call. We've been operating here for about a quarter of a century.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being on the call with us. And it's just really great to have all of you here. Just want to give people a heads up. We've also invited Alistair MacGregor, who is our NDP critic for agriculture, onto the call. He's currently actually sitting on the agricultural committee. It is going on right now in Ottawa. So he's going to jump in just for the last 25 minutes or so. Hopefully the committee doesn't run late. It sometimes does, but he's going to join us at least at the end of this call sometime after 1 p.m. That's Pacific Standard Time for those folks who are tuning in from across the country. And so what I wanted to maybe do to start is just do a quick round from each of you about what you think the important issues are and kind of how you've been thinking about food security before, during, and after COVID-19. So I'm going to pass it over to Paul Taylor, talking a little bit about how each person here, each of our panelists, looks at and what lens they're bringing to the conversation of COVID-19, food security, before, during, after. Paul, over to you.
Thank you. So the first thing I'd like to acknowledge is that, everyone in this country, everyone that lives on this land should be food secure. The federal government, I think, first introduced it in 1966 and ratified in 1976, a right to food. So there's no reason that people should be food insecure in this country. I think largely the reason people are is as a result of government downloading of wicked problems onto nonprofit organizations. So I think that's critical to acknowledge that for about 4.5 million Canadians, food insecurity has been a crisis in this country for a long time. When I think about the context of COVID-19 and what I'm seeing, I go for walks in the morning, almost every morning, and I see the bus pass me by. And every time I see that bus go by, I see Black and brown folks, often women, headed to work. And those are folks that we have deemed essential workers, but we don't pay them anywhere near the amounts of money that we should. When I think about what police officers make in this country, between $100,000 to $150,000, I think it's radically different compared to what we pay these essential workers who are risking their lives, leaving their children, who know it's dangerous to be outside, to workplaces that aren't always providing adequate PPE, that don't have the right amount of sick days. And I think they're making that risk because of things like needing to access food. So I think when we look at after this, whatever that looks like, I think one of the things we're going to have to do is do everything we can to fight back against the kind of BS neoliberal push for austerity. I think it's the retrenchment of social programs in the welfare state that have really got us in this place to begin with. So.
Thanks so much, Paul. And just want to open that up. Wonderful and important lens that you're bringing. Feel free for our other panelists here on the call to either respond or bring something completely new to this conversation, just to kind of kick us off.
I can probably jump in here. So, before COVID, we spent a lot of time as a food movement talking about food insecurity and the problems. And COVID has just added flame to understanding these things. The other things we've been talking about are climate change and the effect of climate change on food production, the effect of food production on climate change, and all of those things. All of that was fairly strong. I think COVID has given us the opportunity to look at what the possibilities are for fixing things and also where some of the big problems are. So I hope that, as Paul says, when we move forward, we can avoid the problems of the past and move towards a more just system.
Thanks so much, Joan. Passing it over either to JJ or Aaren.
Yeah, so I think, one of the big things is around the direction that we're going with capitalism, and we have been going since COVID. When COVID happened, we saw Facebook groups pop up, community members coming together, trying to support each other, accessing food, supporting people that are immunocompromised or unable to leave their houses, We saw a lot of single families, single mothers posting saying, hey, I can't afford groceries. Can someone help me out this month? Knowing that the food bank was getting an ensuite of people, and that model needs to really be decentralized because in Victoria, it's not okay for tons of families to be going to the downtown core to get their foods. They need to be going to neighborhoods, into their neighborhoods where there's other social services. I think one of the most interesting things that I'm seeing is kind of the conversation is picking up so much around food security and what does it mean to have community built around food. And this is where I'm seeing the mass amount of opportunity and the shift. And I think right now, Laurel, you having these conversations, we're seeing it at the provincial level as well. Like people are really excited to say, what does a different food system look like? And what does it look like when we're relying on each other a lot more for our food and for our community support?
Thanks so much, Aaren. Maybe I'll pass it over next to JJ to jump in here.
Unmute. Okay. Yeah, I think, so for me, this is like a really big question. I think especially because when I think of pre-COVID, that is such a long, depending how far back we go, that's such a long period. As someone who is a farmer and works on land daily, definitely something that I think about a lot is my relationship to land and the way that I came into sort of stewardship of it. And that's part of a larger historical process of colonization. And so I think, from the perspective of pre-COVID food insecurity has been a tool of colonization for a very long time. And, the decimation of buffalo herds, historically, currently, the decimation of the salmon population, herring fisheries, oil spills. The Health Nation a couple of years ago, there was a big oil spill in their territory that decimated their traditional clam beaches. Those are things that I think about too, and I think about pre-COVID food insecurity and the ways that we have. For me, as a settler, I'm practicing a type of agriculture that does not have a very long history on these lands, and so that's part of my thinking. Definitely also from a more sort of contemporary policy perspective, farmers, we're seeing the aging of the farming population. Right, so I think sort of my last point was just wanting to echo what Paul was saying, in that we do all have a right to food, and it has been unevenly applied. And especially from a producer perspective, a lot of the people producing our food are Black and brown people, and a lot of the farm managers are white. And so there is a class and race issue that's happening even in our production, as well as in sort of access to food in our communities.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, JJ, for recapping and for kind of putting in that important lens around our food systems and farms. I want to jump into some of the questions that we received from the folks who are tuning in. And so the first one that I have here on the list is, when the weather becomes hotter and folks who are homeless or precariously housed are not able to sit together inside, how are we going to ensure safe food delivery and storage of curbside meals from drop-in centers and shelters? And so Taylor, looks like you want to, or Paul, it looks like you want to jump in. Why don't you unmute yourself and go for it?
Okay, that question to me, and you're probably going to find that I'm going to talk very little about food, but in any event, that question to me is really easy. We can do something like end homelessness. We're one of the richest countries in the world. We used to be building much more housing, affordable housing, social housing, co-ops. That's the way to tackle that issue, I think. Not worrying, not like setting our sights at, curbside meal drop off and that sort of thing. I think what COVID-19 is doing is, as Aaren said, this is creating an opportunity for us to think big about what's possible. So I really want us to kind of reject the tinkering that we've been conditioned to think is what we can aspire to. So let's think big. Let's end homelessness.
Do you want to go, Joan?
Jump in.
I'll totally second that. And I think if you look over the last, 40 years of emergency food supply through food banks when there has not been a food emergency. It's been an income emergency. We've seen through COVID, when we give people income, they go buy their food, which is available.
Yeah, and really, you know, like I love the idea of let's end homelessness. And what we're seeing, like the province in BC has bought a handful of hotels to be able to house people. And that's a good way forward. But I'm also wanting to make sure that we're creating social housing and that it is mixed housing as well. We're not just putting people over there and saying, okay, now this is a problem over here. It's like we're integrating people, we're having people as part of our community, and as a community, we're holding each other up. And so what I want to see is, you know, these hotels that the government's buying, I want to see more social services there. I know one of them has a really cool restaurant in the bottom. Like, let's turn that into a non-for-profit restaurant that everyone can eat at. It's not just for people that are experiencing homelessness or food insecurity. It's for all of us. We're all coming together.
I think that's critical, you know, having those affordable, because what happens, I find, with those mixed kind of models is they displace low-income folks because the services don't respond to their needs. So if we have things like the nonprofit cafe, I think that's a critical piece, that we have affordable access points for folks to remain in their communities.
I think one of the things that's connected to this, and I love how this conversation has gone into really how our social support structures and the investments in housing are all connected to food security. One of the questions we got from email was around basic income. And in COVID-19, we've seen the CERB, the Canada Emergency Response Benefit. It has provided some security for the people who are eligible. There are still people falling through the cracks of that system. And for people who applied at the very beginning on March 15th, it runs out in June. So 16 weeks is now past. If the government doesn't decide to extend this, the people who have lost employment, who were relying on this, all of a sudden won't be able to potentially pay for their rent, pay for food. And so it's also opened up this conversation about universal guaranteed basic income. And curious about the folks on the line here, what you all think about that idea and how it might connect to food security. I'll open up the floor to folks again.
I can jump in, I guess. I think I've been advocating for basic income for years now. I don't think it's the only answer. It's not a solo answer. It needs to be included, housing and all sorts of other things, transit, childcare, all sorts of things. We can't give people a basic income and assume that it's going to fix everything, but it is definitely an excellent starting place.
The live stream has cut out, but I think we should just move forward with the recording. And folks on Facebook are aware.
Great, thanks so much, Susan, for your support through all of the technical difficulties. Just want to check in with our other folks here around this idea of basic income and food security.
I think the introduction of the CERB has done something really, really interesting. You know, we used to talk about income-based interventions, kind of pre-80s, pre-Thatcher, Reagan, and Mulroney, and something happened in the 80s. It wasn't debated in Parliament, but we shifted from income-based transfers to food-based transfers, and we saw the proliferation of food banking. So I think those conversations happened in boardrooms. But I think I'm going to agree completely with what Joan said. You know, for me, it's not just about basic income, because I think we've got to take a step back and think about a decent quality of life, of which a basic income is one of the tools, including pharmacare, housing, and all of those pieces. But I also feel an important piece that's often missing in these conversations around basic income and a decent quality of life moving forward is they don't take into account the systemic inequities that have existed for far too long. So I feel like we can't have conversations about basic income as a go-forward piece without having meaningful conversations about reparations at the same time.
Here. I'm just gonna jump in for a second. Susan, if our guests, if you four are open to it, there were about 10 people who kept on jumping from live stream to live stream. Susan, if you wanted to send them the link and that they could actually join into our Zoom call, we'll just make sure their videos are off so that they're not in the recordings, and then they can actually listen in and can post in the chat box any additional questions as things come up. Just want to get a quick poll of our folks here, if that's okay with you. Great. Susan, if you don't mind sending off a message to anyone on that live stream who'd been listening in, inviting them into this conversation as well. So maybe what I'll do—
The link, just to be clear?
Yeah, just the link and the password to sign in.
Okay.
Thanks so much. Maybe I'll jump into the next question. And it says, I think COVID-19 has thrown a big light on the concentration of the meatpacking industry. Three meatpacking plants conduct a whopping 85% of meat processing in Canada. I'm really concerned about the concentration and think that we need to diversify and localize small community-supported meat processors. What policies can be put into place to achieve this? So for maybe first thoughts from you four.
Yeah, this is definitely a big question. I think before I even want to dive into like kind of the local policy piece, I want to talk about workers' rights, and that a lot of these folks, you know, as Paul and JJ have both mentioned and beautifully articulated, it's about a lot of these people are migrant workers, Black and brown families, working class people that are in these jobs. CERB isn't going to help them all the time. They can't maybe access it, and they need their jobs. And so they're going into these very confined quarters to be able to process our meat. And there's no other option. You know, we're hearing kind of some of the horrific stories of people being forced back to work. And so these are some issues that we really need to address around workers' rights. And that's, I think, the foremost thing that's most important. Obviously, I play more in the policy side of things, especially around local and municipal policy. We're seeing some really cool, I know Comox Valley is pushing for farmers being able to process their animals on their own farm, which I think is a fantastic policy. But making sure other things don't get in the way. I think Salt Spring Island is a great example where they tried to create a mobile abattoir that went around from island to island. And then there was all these fire policies and building policies that were put on top, and they couldn't do it. So they raised all this money, created this massive structure that was going to be mobile. And then in the end, we had all these little policies that ended up getting in the way, and they had to create something that couldn't support the rest of the Gulf Islands. And so it's a really layered and complex situation, but I think there are ways forward.
Yeah, I would say I think that having local food processing, I think, yeah, what Aaren said, absolutely, I agree and echo with. I think workers' rights are a super important piece of the puzzle there. And I also think that a lot of producers, small producers and medium-sized producers, have been trying to get local processing capacity back up and going again for years and years, because it is a major issue for farmers that we can't do value added, we can't preserve our harvest, we can't process our harvest in ways that are economically feasible. And so, yeah, I think if that's something that we see coming out of this, I think it's really unfortunate that people, human beings, had to suffer and be subjected to those sorts of conditions to get us here. But certainly that's a direction that we need to go for a wide variety of reasons.
Can I jump in? Joan, did you want to go? I really just want to speak specifically around some of the workers' rights and just how my mind is boggled by a piece of this, you know? And in particular, when we're talking about workers' rights, I think there are lots of workers' rights that need to be upheld. But right now, in the context of the pandemic, access to paid sick days is key. We have people going into these large meat processing facilities who are concealing the fact that they're ill, you know, and it's because of the precarity that they're facing. So I think, so the part that boggles me is, you know, the government is also providing bailouts to, you know, these organized businesses like Cargill that are owned by American billionaires. So I think one of the first things I'd like to see the government stop doing is giving our money away to billionaires. I think they have enough. And the second piece is I'd like to see government leadership around breaking up and preventing these types of industry monopolies. It's not right.
And just to kind of interject here, Cargill actually has the most billionaires all in one family. And when we're thinking about policy solutions to a lot of the issues that we're facing right now, the kind of conversation from the right is often, how are we going to pay for it? And if we had a fair taxation system where we actually had the people who are at the very, very top, the companies, the corporations, the wealthiest among us, actually paying their fair share in taxes and wealth tax, as well as just the current taxation system, which has so many holes and allows people to hold their money offshore, we would have significantly more funds to actually address some of these issues. And just also here on the paid sick leave piece, this is something we've been pushing for. We got a commitment from the federal government to work with the provinces on. But we're going to have to see some serious ambition from the federal government. Yes, we have here in BC a government that's willing to work with them and on board. But if we want to get some of the provinces who might have a more conservative outlook on the world, we are going to have the federal government step up with some serious leadership when it comes to 10 days of paid sick leave. And just horrific to see what's happening in Cargill and other processing plants, and the deaths and the impact on people. And we also saw our first death of a temporary foreign worker this past week. And I think it's a kind of important part of this conversation around food security that, that people are in conditions where they are put at risk, but also that for a lot of people, there isn't actually a pathway to stay here, that we're bringing people to here to work, and there isn't a pathway for them to make a home here, and if they want to, if they so choose. There's some pilot programs, but really there's not a clear way for most of the temporary foreign workers who are coming to Canada to stay if they want to. Maybe I'll open the floor up around temporary foreign workers or anything else that's coming up through this conversation.
Yeah, the temporary foreign worker thing has really flummoxed me for years. And the whole idea that there is no pathway, there's no rights, there's nothing. You get sick, in previous to COVID, you got sick, you got put on a plane home. You had no right to change farms. The whole thought that our food system is built on that kind of abuse of human rights is abhorrent. And if COVID sheds more light on that, another sort of silver lining. And I think, moving on from that, we need to come with a new way of measuring all of this economic growth that we try to measure. If we don't measure on the health of our people and our planet, we're not going to make it. I see Paul's gonna.
No, I totally agree. I think this conversation also needs to come with our conversation around local food. There's a large portion of our local food that when we think about it, we think of, Old MacDonald. We don't necessarily think about those migrant workers. Sure, we're not flying food thousands of miles. We're bringing people those thousands of miles, and we're treating them poorly. And as Laurel said, not providing permanent pathways for them. So I think that conversation, I think there's an opportunity to engage folks, many of us passionate about local food, to say it's only sustainable if we're taking care of workers, all workers, regardless of where their permanent homes are.
I think one of the tensions, and I don't have the answer to this, is around, and one of the things I hear a lot is kind of the local food system, the cost of food if you're having it grown by farmers that are paying their employees living wage, and then the farms, the larger farms that are bringing migrant workers in and paying them so little. And now there's this big push to have, Canadian residents, BC residents working on these farms and getting paid higher pay. And I'm really concerned what's going to happen to those migrant workers, that families rely on those jobs. And this is something we're going to have to figure out, I think, in the very near future.
Yeah, I think it's interesting seeing some of that conversation around maybe Canadians can take these jobs for higher pay. is really telling. Farm labor is skilled work, and it's very hard work. And we are, I agree, we're not paying people nearly enough for it, and we're not treating them well. And that's a serious problem. So yeah, I just wanted to echo what everyone said. And I also wanted to go back a little bit, Laurel, to what you were saying about taxation. I think you're absolutely right. Having fair and equitable taxation is really important. It's also a question of government spending priorities. I know, I keep thinking, we bought a pipeline for $6 billion. And, more locally in Victoria, the police budget takes 24% of our municipal budget, which is about $58 million. And I just can't help, every time I hear those figures, I really can't help but wonder, or be sort of flabbergasted at the difference in scale that people who I knew who are working in the food system, doing food system work, doing social justice work, doing social services work, the scale of budget that they're talking about is orders of magnitude smaller than what those numbers are like. And I would love to see some of that money reallocated.
Here. And just, we bought that pipeline initially for 4.5 billion, then there were a few million added, and then, most recently they committed up to $12 million to complete the expansion project. And so $1 billion to complete the expansion project. And this is something, as we go into kind of a recovery phase from COVID, there are people, we've seen the op-eds in the papers who are saying pipelines are the answer to stimulate the economy. Kind of thinking through, one of the questions we had submitted by folks was how do we address food security and insecurity without relying on charity or emergency response models? And I'm curious, as we're looking forward at the recovery phase and kind of how you envision what a just and sustainable recovery would be for food security and food systems. I just kind of want to open up that conversation.
I think no one's going to jump in. I think the decommodification of food is such an important piece. I think one of the biggest challenges we're dealing with is around farmers having to continually, their work is about selling the food. A lot of farmers choose farming because they have a passion for it. They see it as so important, connecting to the land, and then selling food is this added thing. And that's where I see a lot of the tensions play out in my community, is around farmers trying to make enough money to live. What if farmers had the money that they needed and food was a right? And so that meant the food that they grow is for the community. People are able to access it. We're not turning it into a commodity. I think that's one of the biggest things I would like to see moving forward.
Yeah. Someone else jump in.
Go ahead, Paul.
Sure. I think charity is not good in this sense. Charity means that the governments, our successive previous governments have all gotten a great big F. In the context of the right to food, if we have 4.4 million people that are hungry, our governments are failing us. I think one of the biggest, there are two challenges that kind of come to mind for me when I think about these sorts of issues. And one is that we have to shift people's knowledge of what food insecurity means. We produce more than enough food in this country to feed at present the folks who live in this country. So it's not about shuffling food around. It's about people's ability to buy the food that they need, and that's where I really think joined up policy is what's key. That we've kind of referenced. Income floor connected with a guarantee around basic service provision. The other thing that I think is critical, food banks started in 1981 in this country and have proliferated, and we have tons and tons of people, millions of people that are food insecure. I think we have to be really mindful of the conversation around food waste. I think I heard that the government was purchasing $50 million worth of produce that wasn't going to be sold and distributing it to charities. Well, I think that's really interesting because they're already acknowledging that the way to support people during this issue is through cash transfers, the $2,000 CERB. So you know, the kind of redistribution of food. I think that's important. We need to reduce our food waste for sure, for all kinds of reasons. But I think it's really important for folks in the movement to make sure that we're separating that conversation from one around food insecurity and poverty.
Absolutely. Now, unless I didn't see, oh, actually, Joan, are you jumping in here?
I was just going to reiterate what Paul said around food waste, because we have conversations daily about why are we wasting food? How do we get it to the people that need it? I mean, the conversation should be, well, A, we shouldn't waste food in the first place. We're throwing stuff away. What kind of society treats food that way? It's the revaluing of food that we've talked about. It's an important life-giving resource that we all need and share. It builds community, it builds culture, it creates connections, all of these wonderful things. We shouldn't be wasting it. And we have this, you know, the old garbage food for garbage people. What kind of respect and opportunity are we giving people when we say, well, let's look after that food waste because we have people that need it? That whole conversation is not respectful.
Here, here. And I want to return to the conversation around food waste once Alistair joins us as well, because there was a question just about the legislation, and Alistair MacGregor, our critic for agriculture in the NDP, along with one of our former MPs, Ruth Ellen Brousseau, had brought forward some legislation and looking at some policy pieces around food waste, but that we need to really be focused on the equity and the justice piece when it comes to food security. Great, why don't we jump into another question? We have had quite a number of people join into the call here in Zoom. So I just want to invite those folks, if you do want to ask additional questions, you can type in the chat and I'll see them and I can relay them to our panelists here. But I'm just going to jump into one of the next questions. And the question is, how do we make sure that community-based initiatives, webinars, community gardens, balcony garden kits, food boxes are accessible to the people who need it the most? And maybe, why don't I pass this over to you, Paul? You're up on my screen.
Sure. Like, this question befuddles me. Lots of questions befuddled me, but this one is, you know, with respect to the person who asked the question, you know, I think, how does a charity figure out who needs it the most? I think that's part of the problem. We try and do that, and we waste all kinds of resources and our time trying to figure out who deserves it, who doesn't. I've had so many conversations with folks. I remember one person saying to me, oh, look at those people in the food bank line. I know they have jobs. Well, 60% of people in this country who are food insecure derive their income from employment. So I think, I remember when I was in high school, you know, this is the first time I've ever done a panel with a colleague or a former, JJ and I went to high school together. Yeah, but in any event, you know, I remember that there was a free like lineup for some TT, some transit support. And I grew up in a low income family. And, you know, I would see that line outside of the office after school. I wasn't wanting anything to do with that poor line. So I think this whole idea of deservedness, we've really got a challenge. It supports us in, you know, designing programs also for segments of the population that we think deserve our support, and neglect other segments of the population that reflect the largest growing demographic of food insecurity and poverty.
And I just want to quickly say that that's one of the amazing things about food programs, is it can bring all sorts of people together from different cultures, different economic backgrounds, it is a connector, and that's the beauty of it. We shouldn't be trying to divide people on any grounds.
And I think it's important to acknowledge that the programs that have come out during COVID-19 are exactly the kind that Paul's talking about, that look at who deserves support and who deserves funding. The CERB, you know, if you made less than $5,000 last year, you actually aren't eligible, which means for whatever reason, whether it's because you were unemployed, because you were taking care of an ailing parent, because you happened to go out of the country for that year, whatever the reason, you are not eligible for the supports, and it means that you are likely food insecure, you're likely struggling to pay rent if you're able to keep a roof over your head. And designing these kind of programs that seem to be specifically designed to leave people out defeats the purpose of actually providing the supports. So thanks for both Joan and Paul for those comments. I want to jump into another question, and it's from Catherine. I'm interested in exploring what we can do to make BC generally and Vancouver Island specifically self-sufficient in food.
Very big question. And, you know, it's interesting. This has been going through my mind a lot lately, is around, can we actually be self-sufficient? Is that realistic within a globalized society? I think it's a fantastic goal to hit it. And I'm thinking, you know, like more, I'm like, okay, could we become 70% self-sufficient and that 20%? I get worried. A lot of our food is grown in the global south. If we aren't purchasing food from those families, like they're going to be experiencing even further poverty than they are now. And so I think that's something to think about. We are a wealthy country, and for us to become fully sufficient on food, yes, it's great and it's important, and it creates this reliance, but in our globalized society, I think we'd actually create a lot of harm in doing that. And so that's been something that's been kind of playing over in my head recently. It's like, how do we create that shift of saying, yes, we want to be food secure, but at the same time, we're going to be, the reliance that people have on our purchasing of food from them is huge. And how do we shift it in a way that doesn't create harm in that?
I also think, you know, these conversations, I'm going to come back to this piece, you know, it's often a kind of white dominant narrative around local food. We talked about migrant workers. We talked about the support to workers growing food in the global south. Well, if we say that Canada is a country that is welcoming and diverse, well, we need to be able to support people to access the type of food that makes them feel comfortable, that they're familiar with. I remember for my mother, when we were growing up, it was going into our community for, you know, green bananas, mangoes, papaya, and things like that. So I think it's also really important to recognize that people need access to that food here, because as we all know, food is so important to our sense of feeling comfort and at home.
JJ or Joe, do you want to jump in on this one?
Sure. I think one thing that I was thinking about with this question is kind of zooming out a little bit from sort of a land-based agriculture and looking at wider food systems. So, you know, for me living on this island, I've been thinking a lot lately personally sort of about how I engage with seafoods and how I engage with protecting those food systems. And yeah, I mean, I think Paul's right, and Aaren are both right in kind of bringing up impacts on global south and sort of access to different types of foods and supporting folks in all those sectors. Yeah, and I what am I trying to say here? I guess I wonder. I also want to kind of zoom out a little bit and think about, like, how are we protecting existing food systems, existing food sources outside of agriculture? How are we protecting our environment? How are we combating climate change? How are we making sure that Indigenous folks, you know, there's a lot of people on Vancouver Island who are Indigenous who are doing a lot of really great work around food systems restoration. How are we supporting those people? How are we supporting Indigenous food sovereignty? All those sorts of questions, I think, come into play for me with this one also.
And making sure that we have water to drink with that food that we're eating, you know. Yeah.
I want to also just go back to one of the things, Aaren, you mentioned just around looking at that kind of the interdependence of our world currently. And if folks know Harsha Walia, who is now the executive director of the BC Civil Liberties Association, but formerly was an academic, she talked a lot about you know, not necessarily, sometimes in the context of food security, but kind of sweatshops inside the nation and sweatshops outside, and that that there is this kind of global system set up that continues to exploit Black and brown bodies, and that our current globalized system is set up in such a way that we rely on the cheap labor overseas, and then also for undocumented temporary foreign workers relying on that cheap labor inside of the nation as well. And so thinking about food security and workers' justice and equity in our world coming out of COVID-19, kind of what are some of the pieces and steps forward that we can be taking to address those kind of larger global systems of inequality?
I think the pandemic really highlighted that we're not alone in this, right? Like as a country and as a world, people are, you know, it's coming with agreements that we're all closing our borders, that we're going to be doing things to make sure that we're trying to keep people safe. And so, you know, when the pandemic first happened, I had this hope. I'm like, wow, this is all of us trying to work together. Maybe we can jump off of this and build something really great. I don't know what that would look like, but it gave me at least a glimpse of hope.
And I think that the conversation that each one of you have been bringing up around colonization, you know, applies to this larger global system, but then also to our local relationship to our land, the land that we're on, and you know, having some of that kind of personal community work that needs to happen in terms of decolonization, but also feeding that into our policies and the work that we're doing, the steps that we're taking.
Yeah, I think, you know, I'm not going to talk, yeah, when I'm thinking about Canada and post-COVID, and I think one of the things we've got to tackle to make sure that everyone has food to eat, unequivocally, are things like anti-Black racism. So FoodShare partnered with the University of Toronto to do some research last year, I think it was, to look at the Canadian Community Health Survey, to look at the correlations of race and food insecurity, looking specifically at Black folks. Surprisingly, it was the first time that it had ever been done in this country. And what we found was that Black folks in Canada are 3.5 times more likely to be food insecure than white folks. 12% of white kids live in food insecure households, 36% of Black kids. We found that, you know, part of the narrative around a basic income has been, in the movement, has been, well, we have one already for seniors. So when people become a senior, we actually see their risk and vulnerability to food insecurity decrease significantly. And it's because of things like access to the old age security and guaranteed income supplement. That's true broadly. But what our research found was that when you look specifically at Black Canadians, it doesn't provide the same protections. So we can't, and it's likely, and it's, yeah, so pervasive, but it's likely because, of course, you know, things like saving for your pension and that sort of thing. If you don't have access to decent work, well-paying jobs, promotions within that work, within those jobs, you're not set up for retirement. I also, one other thing I just want to highlight that really shocked me about this research that we did with Proof was that we looked at where people get their income from, saw, of course, most people get it from work. But when we looked at social assistance, we actually saw this difference in the amount that white folks receive across the country and Black folks across the country in the various provinces, of course, but aggregately we saw a difference. And we thought, well, how could that be? And it's because disability income supports are included in that, suggesting that white people are either more likely to be approved for disability or approved for more. So I think we also have to have an equity lens as we have these conversations about income interventions as well, to make sure that they're actually supporting the folks that we know are the most vulnerable, the most food insecure. And the other piece is just around Indigenous food sovereignty. You know, I think that is one of the things that has to be a part of recognizing Indigenous land and treaty rights is one of the best things we can do for climate, for Indigenous food sovereignty and the like. So, yeah.
Thanks so much, Paul. And just want to, since you brought up the piece around disability, the recent announcement from the federal government is yet another one of these programs that is designed to leave people out. About 60% of people who have a disability are not actually eligible for the new supports. And so we're going to have to keep pushing on that end. And then also, yeah, the piece around Indigenous food sovereignty. And JJ, you mentioned there's so many organizations here in our community who are doing incredible work. The Aboriginal Friendship Center has a food box and FoodShare program, but we also have the Wasanich Nation, and Aaren, I think you've worked with, was it a Esquimalt Nation on some food security?
Yeah, Songhees and Esquimalt Nation with the school district doing land and language revitalization. Yeah, there's a lot of amazing work happening around this, and it's like, how do we leverage it and support it and remind all of us that like we are settlers to this land, and that you know, there's this big juxtaposition between the food that's growing on this land, especially, you know, JJ, you touched on it so well around farming, and yet that has displaced Indigenous food systems. And so when we talk about food security, we're talking about farming, we're talking about agriculture, we're not talking about Indigenous food systems and the harm that's been caused by displacing Indigenous food systems when settlers came here.
Just want to acknowledge that we're not all we're not all settlers on this land. And I also want to just Dawn Morrison is, when I lived in BC, I had an opportunity to meet. She's doing incredible work around with a number of Indigenous leaders. The Indigenous Food Sovereignty Working Group. I learned so much just from listening to her vision of what's possible. So.
Great, and there's some great research that's been done here on Vancouver Island around Indigenous food sovereignty, and what we'll do is maybe I'll get Susan to send it out to our participants as well. And for folks who may have joined in partway through, just wanted to also acknowledge again that, you know, one of the lenses we're missing on this panel is Indigenous voices talking about Indigenous food sovereignty. And so my apologies for us being unable to get someone in here for this conversation. We're going to have more of these conversations and potentially something focused specifically on Indigenous food sovereignty. I want to move on to the next question, and also just remind folks who are in here with us in the Zoom call that you're welcome to post additional questions in the chat. So one of the questions is, on page, Vancouver Island produces about 4% of its food. It used to produce more. Local farm produce is uncompetitive compared to produce from California, where a lot of our fruits and vegetables come from. California depends on our groundwater for irrigation. Those water sources are rapidly drying up. Free trade rules prohibit tariffs on food imports. What can we do to increase our own food on Vancouver Island in view of these facts? And maybe, since we've covered a little bit of this conversation, also tying in this question around water and water security into what we're talking about.
Yeah, I think this question is interesting, sort of because of the way that it frames the problem. I think a lot of the problems that this question is kind of identifying are, and the whole conversation I think that we're having about food security, I think a lot of folks have already touched on this, but food insecurity and a lot of these things that this person is identifying are symptoms of a larger systemic issues. And so, you know, yeah, why is food from California less expensive than food grown down the road? You know, why are tariffs not allowed on food imports? Who negotiated those agreements, and what were their interests, and whose interests were they protecting when they negotiated those agreements? And why are we being held accountable to them right now, and who's holding us accountable to them? Those are all questions that sort of came up for me in this question, and I don't have all of the answers, but I do think it's an interesting way that people frame this, right? Is like we're accepting the conditions that we're under, and then we're saying, why isn't this working for us? And it's because the conditions are not appropriate. And so we need to really look at, I think, federal leadership, provincial leadership, you know, civil society leadership, our own selves, and sort of really be participating and advocating for changing those conditions so that things like food insecurity are not so much of an issue.
And just so folks know, in the last round of kind of free trade negotiations, which actually were happening right before COVID-19 hit, one of our MPs, Daniel Blakey, was really highlighting the lack of transparency, which I think most people know when it comes to trade deals. There is a lot of secrecy. There is not a lot of transparency about what's being agreed upon and by who. Some of the provisions around the secret tribunals, which corporations can then sue countries under for environmental or changes in legislation that would impact their profit. So we fought very hard against that, and we got some wins, but a lot of the wins that we got, interestingly enough, as a country, were more because of the US Democrats who got rid of some of those provisions. It wasn't actually our government who our government was actually okay signing a number of things away that continued to have a lack of transparency in these. And we've gotten a small piece. Daniel Blake is continuing to push and work on it, but there will be, at least within our parliament, an increase of transparency, some broad overstrokes when we go into these trade negotiations in the future, so that we can at least have a peek about what our government is agreeing to and what that means for our people here in Canada. Maybe, unless I see someone else jump in for this one, I'm going to move on to the next question. I think I would like to know, what have the biggest food security issues been? Who has been the most impacted? And would having universal basic income help with food security? We've talked a little bit about that. Or is the root problem here not due to lack of funds and more lack of supply? And I'll open up the floor. Joan, do you want to jump in?
Well, I think if you look at the proof research, the definition of food insecurity is a lack of financial ability to buy food. So that's a first start on that. I think if you walk into any grocery store in any of our communities, you will see that there is food. So I'm not sure that lack of supply, sometimes quality of supply and health benefits of the food we see and all of those kind of things may be different, and, you know, unhealthy, cheap food. But I think a universal, as we already said, a universal basic income is a good start to addressing food insecurity, but it is a complex problem, and basic income isn't going to solve it all. We did see when the government gave, I think, $100 to families with children, that those families' food insecurity rates dropped by 25%, so that we know, and as Paul mentioned, the seniors, we know that income makes a difference. We have the proof.
Maybe just to add into this conversation, you know, rather than looking at supply, but also looking at kind of accessibility. I know a number of you have worked around, or at least had conversations around food deserts and the impact on those communities who are impacted by kind of a lack of access to quality food. Just want to open up the floor to that conversation as well.
I think food deserts is an interesting one. You know, I've really been diving into this issue because I think it's something that the organization that I work at for many years has kind of built programs based on this idea of food deserts. But to be quite frank, I don't actually think, at least in urban centers, the research doesn't really support kind of the way many people have been convinced to think about food deserts. Low-income people are so used to traveling far distances to act food and going to various locations. I think that the conversation around access, you know, we talk about food being a right, but we said we've, you know, offloaded that right or that responsibility to charities. I think some of the access issues come up when we have food banks in church basements that aren't accessible. People can't get to them because we know, and I think another important piece around accessibility of the current interventions, if we have 4.4 million people in this country that are food insecure, but only 1 million people accessing food banks across this country, there are a whole host of barriers, and it's not a solution. I think we've spent so much time kind of positioning it as a solution.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with that. I think one of the things, like from a practical standpoint, if we're thinking about policy, I think about municipal policy and urban planning, and how are we actually creating these cities? Are we creating food access points within neighborhoods where there's other resources available. I think schools are a great example of that, where these schools become hubs where families can intersect, where students can intersect. They have a whole bunch of resources there. How are we able to kind of leverage this public infrastructure that's already available, and at the same time do things like that? Yeah, I think it's really important in when we're talking about urban planning and different things.
It looks like Paul's just going to be right back. He's got to plug in his laptop. I also want to acknowledge, it sounds like Alistair, they were debating a motion at the very end of their committee, so it looks like he is delayed. He may not be able to join us. But we do have 15 minutes left. And so one of the questions that was submitted beforehand by email was around what municipal, provincial, and federal policies would make a difference for food security. And maybe we can just go one by one to talk a little bit about what you see as kind of some of the key levers that would make a difference. And so on the order that I have you on my screen, I've got Joan, JJ, Aaren, and Paul.
Oh, darn. That's a big question, how to divide things into to different political levels. I think, first of all levels of government need to understand that they do have a role to play in food security and food systems, from urban planning in cities to provincial sort of agricultural land reserves to, you know, federal programs. So I think everybody has a role to play, and understanding that we do is one of the first steps. I know in municipal governments, and to be fair, I've only lived in Victoria for less than 6 months, so I can't really comment, but I know in municipal governments often don't understand that they do play a role, from community gardens to you know, the urban planning, the walkable communities, healthy communities, public spaces, all sorts of things contribute to a healthy food system. And I'll leave it there because that's a tough question.
And Joan, just as someone who a year ago was on the city council here, I hope that you'll have a really good experience with our council. There are a lot of people very passionate. I was sitting on the urban food table, and there's some really incredible things on the municipal level happening in our community.
Great. I've seen a lot so far, so that's why I didn't want to be critical.
JJ, you're up next, Aaren, and then we'll go to Paul. Just Paul, so you know, the question was around what policies or changes need to happen at the municipal, provincial, and federal levels. What do you see as kind of the key levers moving forward?
Thank you.
Yeah, for someone who doesn't work in policy, this is a very difficult question. But that said, you know, I think there are certain trends that I see farmers talking about. So I'll speak a little bit, I think, from my perspective as a local producer. I know in Victoria, definitely we've had a lot of great support from the municipality in kind of removing red tape that will allow small producers to sell more easily to the public. That definitely has opened up a lot of opportunity for us as producers at Mason Street Farm. There's also, I think, a big piece around undoing or working across departments and sectors at all levels. That is important. Food systems work is inherently interconnected. And so, you know, having, you know, even sort of looking at the aquaculture industry, you know, it's like managed by the Department of Fisheries and the Department of Agriculture, and there's a lot of confusion about who's actually responsible for protecting our coastlines. And that's, you know, and then there's the Department of Energy and all this. Yeah, so I think really working, whatever policies are in place need to be really coming from a variety of perspectives. Yeah, I think at the municipal level, it's also a lot about land use and land use planning and building codes. So, you know, right now, the type of agriculture that I'm practicing is very much rooted in the soil. And if we're paving over soil, it's very difficult to unpave. and rebuild soil that takes a very long time. And we're incredibly fortunate where I'm growing that we've had 30 years of people composting and sort of investing in that soil. And any farmer will tell you that, you know, the soil health is the key to farming, right? You're really kind of cultivating soil, and plants are almost secondary. So yeah, those are some of the things that come off the top of my head. Provincially and federally, I don't interact with provincial and federal policy a ton, but I know that land access for farmers is huge, knowledge transfer, you know, again, kind of sourcing capital. And then, you know, bigger picture, we're on Indigenous land. So as Paul mentioned earlier, you know, honoring treaties, supporting Indigenous communities in BC who are fighting for their food sovereignty, right? If we want to talk about food security, there are a lot of Indigenous folks who are engaged in actively trying to protect their traditional access to their lands and to safeguard those lands. And so we need to support people in doing that as well.
Thanks, JJ. Aaren?
Thanks, JJ. Yeah, I think the Indigenous land piece is so important. And how do we support Indigenous communities in being able to govern their own land and being able to steward the land as well that we're all living on. From a policy standpoint, you know, I don't play a lot in the federal sphere, but a bit in the provincial and municipal. One thing I'd love to see more is around communication between the feds, the province, and municipalities. I think that's a really important piece that doesn't happen a lot. Since COVID, we've seen the government, the province at least, really start to create inter-ministry working groups. And that has had a huge impact where now, you know, Ministry of Health, Ministry of Agriculture, Education, they're all at the table and they're talking about food security. And I think this is a really important piece. It's not just about the policies, it's also about the structuring and the programming. And I think of course, funding is a huge piece, making sure that I think of things like universal school meal programs, basic income, all these different things that are going to also be flowing down into the provinces and having them implement it. So it's like, how are we working with the provinces, allowing some autonomy? And then how are the provinces actually working with the municipalities? Municipalities get unloaded a lot to do a lot of supporting their communities on the ground. And are they actually getting the autonomy they need and the funding they need to do this work? And that's a big question that I keep wondering. You know, Laurel, I got to work with you at the Urban Food Table at City Victoria Council. I think it's great when city councils are able to put forward these motions that do support community access, community meal programs, all those different types of things. But I keep thinking, like, the rubber hits the road at the municipal level. So how are we actually planning our cities, and how are we making sure that our cities are for people, for the climate, and creating strong, resilient communities? So I don't have all the policy answers. I think that could be a long bucket list, I think, of research, but really looking at, like, on the ground, how are we actually building these communities to be supportive of each other?
Thanks, Aaren. Paul?
Yeah, so I was just jotting down some notes. So I'm going to try and say things that haven't been said already. So municipally, and it builds on some of the things that I think have been said. You know, when it comes to food, at least in Toronto, transit is very expensive. And if folks didn't have to pay for transit, they could certainly be eating a lot more food. So I think and the impacts on climate change would be pretty significant if we had more people out of their cars. So I would say first, look at free transit with federal support, of course, with federal dollars. And I think when we, at the provincial level, you know, I think about, we talked a little bit about housing, and housing comes up fairly often. It's one of the biggest expenses for folks. The second biggest expense for folks is childcare. You know, so if we had a public universal childcare program, people wouldn't have to be spending the oodles and noodles of money that they are on childcare, and they could be eating more. So I think, and another provincial one, you know, we talk about universal basic income, but I think that can't exist without increases to minimum wages across the country, because we can't use an income floor as a mechanism that allows employers to pay poor wages. And then lastly, when I think about the federal government, I think it's a bit of a mistake. You hear me talk about various policies at various levels that will impact people's access to food. None of them really have to do with food that I've mentioned. So I think when we have a national food policy that rests in the Ministry of Agriculture and isn't doing the thing that Aaron's talking about, and making sure that they're talking with all the other ministries and approaching it perhaps in the way that we have conversations about housing, I think it's a bit of a miss. So I think those are a few things that might be helpful.
Thanks so much for that, Paul. And then maybe I'll just jump in kind of from the federal lens. Some of the policies that we are pushing for, we've covered a lot of them already. The paid sick leave, that's something we're going to be continuing to push. We've got some potential wins, but we really are going to still need to kind of push for the ambition that will make it happen across the country. I think there's definitely the opportunity to make sure it happens in BC with both levels of government on board. Manitoba, Yukon have expressed some interest, but really what we're hearing from the other provinces is that unless the federal government is going to pay for most or all of it, they're not on board. But I do think we are in this unique situation when we are in a pandemic. This is an opportunity to move forward on some of these pieces that we know are huge gaps. There are going to be a ton of voices who are calling for austerity, calling for privatization, calling for really moving backwards rather than moving forwards. We talked a little bit about the spending priorities on pipelines, but also on LEAF, which is the supports for the large businesses and large enterprises. Huge amounts of liquidity going out to large corporations who oftentimes are able to weather these storms much better than smaller community organizations, a lot of the people who are falling through the cracks. We are going to be continuing to push for investments in transit. We know cities are struggling, and part of our platform was around providing the opportunity for free transit for municipalities who are willing to partner and want to move forward on this. And I think we need to keep pressing for this. We've had some really good movement here in Victoria, and there's a big movement to get it kind of region-wide in our area. So this, I think, is an opportunity. And then I just, since Alistair's not here, I wanted him to speak a little bit more about the temporary foreign workers piece, but we are going to be pressing not only for workers' rights and making sure that there's safety during this kind of crisis period, but ongoing supports and policies that will keep workers safe, and then also provide pathways to actually living here for those workers who want to. It is just kind of re-inscribing that injustice and that inequity the way that we've set up this program. And then I want to put a quick plug in, since we are getting to the end of our time, and just because the NDP has put together a Building for Better kind of task force, and I'm going to be sending the recording of this to them. They're starting to have these conversations across Canada about what it means to build for better, what it means to come out and in the recovery phase have a kind of just and sustainable piece. One of the people on that is our former MP Guy Caron, who will be looking at universal basic income. It's one of his big passions. He's writing a book on it and has so much knowledge in that area. So I think there really is this opportunity. Oh, and look at that. It looks like Alistair MacGregor has just joined us. We've got about 3 minutes left. And so maybe once, Alistair, if you are able to unmute yourself, just in the last little bit, what I'll do is I'll quickly give you a recap. We have covered some questions around temporary foreign workers, around kind of the larger connections between housing, childcare, transit, the pieces that kind of create the conditions where people don't have enough to spend on food. We've talked a lot about Indigenous food sovereignty and the kind of relationship to the land. Maybe I'll let our panelists jump in with anything you might want, Alistair, among those things or beyond to jump in with.
Can I just add one little piece? Sorry, I know I've said a lot, but just one little piece. You know, I keep talking about dreaming big and being bold. You know, I feel like I heard about Hawaii, and they released a feminist. You know, I was inspired by where you were saying this recording was going, and they released a feminist recovery plan. You know, that includes things like a basic, a $25 minimum wage for single moms, free publicly funded childcare. And I got so mad when I heard about it. Happy and enthused, but also mad because I feel like we can have nice things in Canada too.
You're here. Alistair, do you want to jump in? Can we hear you?
Yeah, you know, the Standing Committee on Agriculture went a little bit overboard today, so sorry I joined in so late. And I'll speak with Laurel after this just to get a flavor of most of the conversation that you had. But you know, in terms of what we've been looking at, you know, the Standing Committee on Agriculture has, over the last 4 or 5 weeks, we've really been looking at how COVID-19 has impacted both producers but agri-food processors as well, but also its impact on food insecure communities. The basic theme I've been trying to push through all of our hearings in this matter is how do we build resiliency into our system, because COVID-19 has absolutely laid bare several weaknesses in our food supply system. It's one of the great ironies that we live in a country that produces so much food but still has so many food insecure communities. And so we are still going to continue that study, but we've heard a lot from producers, a lot from food processors, but I really want to expand the conversation to include organized labor like UFCW. They've got a lot of their workers that work in food processing. I want to hear from Migrant Workers Alliance about the conditions that temporary foreign workers find themselves in. Food Banks Canada, you know, the federal government's come in with a program to buy surplus produce and to move it. Is that serve as a model for the future? You know, currently Prince Edward Island has 760 million pounds of potatoes not moving anywhere. So that's an example of you know, how we have a system that's so geared towards export, but when the international order gets a big shock to its system, suddenly everything stops. So it's a huge topic to cover, but it's something I'm very passionate about. And of course, up here in the Cowichan Valley where I live, we have a lot of people who are very dedicated to food security. I used to sit on the board of the Cowichan Green Community, which is a huge organization in our neck of the woods. So I'm very much informed by a lot of very expert local knowledge. And even though, you know, in what Ottawa does sometimes feel like you're flying at 30,000 feet, it's still important to listen to those local voices to make sure that what policies Ottawa puts forward are complementary and working towards our broader shared goal of making sure we have food security for everyone. So there's my Coles notes.
Alistair, thanks so much for the work you're doing on the Agricultural Committee. And I do just want to it is now 1:30, so this is the official end of our conversation. If you need to run right now, feel free to, but I just wanted to kind of open it up in case there were any closing words from Aaren, JJ, Joan, or Paul. Oh, Paul, you're still muted.
Just saying thanks for having me. It was a pleasure. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks. Yeah, it was a really great pleasure and good conversation. It was nice to get to meet you, Paul.
Yeah, likewise. I guess that day I met you.
Exactly. Great.
Well, thank you all so much for taking the time. Thanks also to the people who joined and kind of went through our technical difficulties with us and ended up joining the Zoom call. It was great to have you on. I am just inspired by the work that you four are doing, and also Alistair, so grateful to have you as a colleague and inspired by the work you're up to. And I just want to say, yeah, thanks for bringing your perspectives and your lens to this conversation. I hope that I can follow up in the future, hoping to have more of these conversations. So I would love to have you back.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks so much, Laurel.
Thanks.
Bye, everybody.